Sarah Martinez stood behind the pharmacy counter at the local CVS, her heart racing as she heard the familiar snickers from the customers waiting in line. The sleeve of her uniform had ridden up slightly, revealing the edge of an intricate tattoo that covered most of her right forearm. She quickly pulled the fabric down, but it was too late. The damage was already done. "Look at that," whispered Mrs. Henderson, a regular customer who always seemed to find something to complain about. What kind of person gets those awful markings all over themselves? No wonder young people today can't find decent jobs. Her companion, an elderly man with a permanent scowl, nodded in agreement. Disgraceful. In my day, only criminals and sailors had those things. Now every kid thinks they're some kind of artist. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger. She had heard these comments countless times before, but they never got easier to bear. The tattoo wasn't just some random design she had chosen on a whim. It held deep meaning, representing one of the most important chapters of her life. But how could she explain that to people who had already made up their minds about her? She focused on counting out the elderly woman's medication, trying to ignore the continued whispers and pointed stares. Other customers had joined in, making loud comments about unprofessional appearance and what's wrong with kids these days. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she handed over the prescription. The morning had started like any other. Sarah arrived at work early, prepared for another day of serving her community at the neighborhood pharmacy. She took pride in her job, knowing that she was helping people get the medications they needed to stay healthy. Many of the elderly customers relied on her knowledge and friendly service, and she genuinely cared about their well-being. But there was always this undercurrent of judgment from certain customers who couldn't see past her appearance. The tattoo that decorated her arm was a constant source of criticism from people who didn't know her story. They saw the dark ink and immediately assumed she was trouble, someone to be avoided or looked down upon. What they didn't know was that Sarah was a veteran. She had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan as a combat medic, saving lives under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The tattoo on her arm was a memorial piece, honoring the fallen soldiers from her unit who never made it home. Each element of the design represented someone she had tried to save, someone whose memory she carried with her every single day. The names of her fallen comrades were woven into the intricate design, along with symbols that represented their shared experiences in the desert. A medic cross sat at the center, surrounded by dog tags, military insignia, and a banner with the dates of their deployment. It was a work of art that had taken months to complete, with every detail carefully planned and executed by a tattoo artist who specialized in military memorial pieces. But strangers didn't see the meaning behind the ink. They only saw what they perceived as rebellious markings that somehow made her less worthy of respect. Sarah had learned to keep her sleeves down at work, hiding the tribute to her brothers and sisters in arms because she was tired of defending herself to people who would never understand. As the morning wore on, more customers came and went. Some were kind and treated her with the respect she deserved as a healthcare professional. Others made their disapproval clear with their expressions and comments. Sarah found herself pulling her sleeves down repeatedly, a habit that had become second nature over the years. Around noon, the pharmacy got busy with the usual lunch rush, people picking up prescriptions on their break, elderly customers who preferred to avoid the morning crowds, and parents grabbing medications for their sick children. Sarah moved efficiently between the register and the medication shelves, her training as a medic having taught her to work quickly and accurately under pressure. It was during this busy period that Colonel James Morrison walked through the front door. He was a tall man in his 50s with graying hair and the kind of posture that immediately identified him as military. He wore a simple button-down shirt and khakis, nothing that would necessarily mark him as a high-ranking Marine officer to the casual observer. Colonel Morrison had recently moved to the area after his latest assignment and was still getting used to the new neighborhood. He needed to pick up a prescription for his wife and had chosen this pharmacy based on its convenient location and good reviews online. As he waited in line, he couldn't help but notice the tension in the air. The whispered comments and disapproving looks directed at the young woman behind the counter caught his attention immediately. He had spent enough years in the military to recognize when someone was being unfairly targeted, and his protective instincts began to stir. There was something about the pharmacy technician that seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place what it was. Sarah finished helping a customer and called out, "Next in line, please." Colonel Morrison stepped forward, studying her face more carefully. There was something in her eyes, a certain bearing in the way she carried herself that reminded him of the young Marines and sailors he had served with over the years. It was the look of someone who had seen combat, who had been tested under fire and emerged stronger. As she processed his prescription, Colonel Morrison noticed her unconscious habit of tugging at her sleeves. He had seen that gesture before, usually from veterans who had tattoos they felt compelled to hide in civilian settings. His suspicions were confirmed when he caught a brief glimpse of what appeared to be military insignia peeking out from beneath her uniform sleeve. The afternoon was about to take a turn that would change everything for Sarah Martinez, though she had no way of knowing it yet. Colonel Morrison finished his transaction with Sarah, but instead of leaving immediately, he stepped aside to observe the continuing situation. More customers had arrived, and the negative comments about Sarah's appearance were becoming increasingly bold and cruel. A middle-aged woman in expensive clothing was particularly vocal in her criticism. "I don't understand why businesses hire people who look like that," she announced loudly to her friend. "It makes the whole place look unprofessional. I'm going to speak to the manager about having someone more appropriate working the counter." Sarah's face had gone pale, but she continued to work with the same professional demeanor she had maintained all day. Colonel Morrison watched as she helped an elderly veteran who had come to pick up his heart medication. The interaction was completely different from the others he had witnessed. "How are you feeling today, Mr. Thompson?" Sarah asked with genuine concern. "Any issues with the new dosage the doctor prescribed?" The old veteran smiled warmly at her. "Much better, thank you for asking. You always take such good care of us folks. My grandson is about your age, and I hope someone treats him as kindly as you treat me." Colonel Morrison noticed how Sarah's entire demeanor changed when she was talking to the veteran. There was a connection there, a mutual understanding that spoke to shared experiences. He also observed how carefully she handled the man's medication, double-checking everything and offering helpful reminders about timing and side effects. After Mr. Thompson left, the complaining woman approached the counter with her prescription. She made no effort to hide her disdain as she slapped her insurance card down on the counter. "I suppose you can handle this without making any mistakes?" she said sarcastically. Sarah maintained her professional composure despite the obvious insult. "Of course, ma'am. Let me look this up for you right away." She processed the prescription quickly and accurately, even though the woman continued to make snide comments about her appearance throughout the transaction. $23.47, Sarah said, holding out her hand for payment. The woman handed over her credit card with obvious reluctance, as if touching Sarah's hand might somehow contaminate her. "You know, when I was young, people had more respect for themselves and others. We didn't go around marking up our bodies like we were pieces of property." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She processed the payment and handed over the prescription bag with the same polite professionalism she had shown every other customer that day. As the woman walked away, she made one final comment that carried clearly across the pharmacy. "Parents these days don't teach their children any values. Look what happens when you let them run wild and make permanent mistakes they'll regret for the rest of their lives." That was the moment Colonel Morrison decided he had heard enough. He had spent 30 years in the Marine Corps, and he recognized courage when he saw it. The young woman behind that counter was showing more strength and discipline than many of the Marines he had commanded. She was taking abuse that no one should have to endure, all while continuing to do her job with grace and professionalism. But what really convinced him to act was what he had noticed about her tattoo during the brief glimpses he had caught. The partial images he had seen looked distinctly military in nature. There had been what appeared to be dog tags, some kind of medical symbol, and what might have been unit insignia, if his suspicions were correct. This young woman was a veteran being mistreated by people who had never served their country a day in their lives. Colonel Morrison had made a career out of standing up for his Marines, and that instinct didn't disappear just because he was in a civilian pharmacy, rather than on a military base. If anything, he felt an even stronger obligation to defend a veteran who was facing discrimination in her own community. He walked back to the counter, where Sarah was helping another customer. This one was a young mother with a sick toddler, and Sarah was patiently explaining how to properly administer the liquid antibiotic. Her manner was gentle and reassuring, and the worried mother visibly relaxed under Sarah's calming influence. "Thank you so much," the mother said gratefully. "You've been so helpful. I was really worried about getting the dosage right." That's what I'm here for, Sarah replied with a genuine smile. Don't hesitate to call if you have any questions. We want to make sure your little one gets better as quickly as possible. After the mother left, Colonel Morrison approached the counter again. The pharmacy had quieted down momentarily, giving him the perfect opportunity for what he was about to do. "Excuse me," he said to Sarah. "I couldn't help but notice some of the comments that have been directed at you today. I wanted you to know that not everyone shares those opinions." Sarah looked up at him with surprise. Most customers either joined in the criticism or pretended not to notice it. It was unusual for someone to openly acknowledge what was happening, let alone offer support. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That's very kind of you to say." Colonel Morrison studied her face more closely. Now that he was looking for it, he could see the telltale signs of someone who had served in combat. There was a maturity in her eyes that went beyond her years, and a way of holding herself that spoke of military training. His suspicions were becoming certainties. "I hope you don't mind me asking," he said carefully, "but did you serve in the military?" Sarah's eyes widened slightly and she unconsciously touched her covered forearm. "Yes, sir. I was a combat medic in the Army, 2 tours in Afghanistan." Colonel Morrison nodded, his respect for the young woman growing even stronger. Combat medics were among the bravest soldiers he had ever known, rushing into danger to save lives while facing enemy fire. The fact that she had done multiple tours spoke to both her courage and her commitment to her fellow service members. "Thank you for your service," he said sincerely. "And I'm sorry you've had to deal with ignorant comments about your tattoo. I'm guessing it has military significance." Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly, and her eyes filled with tears. "It's a memorial piece for the soldiers from my unit who didn't make it home." That was all Colonel Morrison needed to hear. Colonel Morrison felt a surge of anger at the injustice of what he had witnessed. Here was a young woman who had risked her life to save others in one of the most dangerous places on earth, and she was being treated like a criminal by people who had never faced anything more challenging than a long line at the grocery store. "Would you mind showing me your tattoo?" he asked gently. "I'd be honored to see it." Sarah hesitated for a moment, glancing around the pharmacy to make sure no other customers were watching. Then slowly she rolled up her sleeve to reveal the full extent of the memorial piece on her forearm. Colonel Morrison drew in a sharp breath. The tattoo was absolutely stunning, far more elaborate and meaningful than he had imagined. The centerpiece was indeed a medical cross, but it was surrounded by incredibly detailed imagery that told the story of her service. 5 sets of dog tags were arranged around the cross, each engraved with a name and dates. Above them, a banner displayed the insignia of her unit and the words, "All gave some gave all." Woven throughout the design were symbols that only someone with military experience would recognize. A pair of combat boots stood empty beneath the cross, representing fallen soldiers. Poppies, the traditional flower of remembrance, bloomed around the edges. Most powerfully, a pair of hands reached up toward the medical cross, symbolizing both the lives she had tried to save and those who had reached out to her for help. "This is incredible," Colonel Morrison said, his voice thick with emotion. "How long did it take to complete?" "About 6 months," Sarah replied, carefully rolling her sleeve back down. The artist was a veteran himself, and he wanted to make sure every detail was perfect. Each element represents someone specific or something that happened over there. Colonel Morrison nodded, understanding the weight of what she carried. Memorial tattoos were common among veterans, but this one was exceptional in both its artistry and its meaning. The fact that people were mocking something so sacred made his blood boil. "Have you been dealing with this kind of treatment for long?" he asked. Sarah sighed. "Ever since I started working here 2 years ago. Some customers are fine with it, but others, they make it clear what they think of me. I've learned to keep it covered most of the time, but sometimes the sleeve rides up or I forget. Then I have to listen to comments about how I'm unprofessional or how I've ruined my body." "That's completely unacceptable," Colonel Morrison said firmly. "These people have no idea what you've sacrificed for their freedom." Just then, Mrs. Henderson returned to the pharmacy with 2 of her friends in tow. She had apparently gone to spread the word about the inappropriate employee, and now she was back with reinforcements. The 3 women approached the counter with disapproving expressions. "I'm back to speak with your manager," Mrs. Henderson announced loudly. "I've brought some other concerned customers with me. We think it's inappropriate for this establishment to employ someone who clearly doesn't represent the values of our community." Sarah's face went pale again, but she maintained her composure. I can call the manager for you, ma'am. But he's actually at lunch right now, so it might be a few minutes. We'll wait, Mrs. Henderson said, crossing her arms. This is important. Parents bring their children in here, and they shouldn't have to see that kind of display. One of her friends nodded in agreement. It's bad enough that young people get those things, but to flaunt them at work is just unprofessional. What kind of message does that send? Colonel Morrison had heard enough. He had spent his entire adult life defending the principles of honor, courage, and commitment. He had seen young men and women sacrifice everything for their country, and he wasn't about to stand by and watch one of them be humiliated by people who had never served anything but their own interests. Excuse me, ladies, he said, stepping closer to the counter. I couldn't help but overhear your conversation, and I think there's something you should know about this young woman. Mrs. Henderson looked at him with surprise. I'm sorry, but this doesn't concern you. We're dealing with a customer service issue. Actually, it does concern me, Colonel Morrison replied calmly. You see, I'm a Marine colonel, and this young lady is a combat veteran who served our country with distinction in Afghanistan. The tattoo you're complaining about is a memorial to fallen soldiers from her unit. The three women looked taken aback, but Mrs. Henderson quickly recovered. Well, that may be, but it still doesn't excuse unprofessional appearance in a workplace. There are standards that need to be maintained. Colonel Morrison felt his temper rising, but years of military discipline helped him maintain control. You're absolutely right about standards, he said evenly. And the standard I see here is a young woman who has served her country with honor, who saves lives for a living, and who treats every customer with respect and professionalism, despite facing constant criticism from people who don't know anything about her. He paused, letting his words sink in. The real question is, what standard are you setting? What kind of message are you sending when you attack a veteran for honoring her fallen comrades? Sarah watched the exchange with growing amazement. No one had ever defended her like this before. Most people either joined in the criticism or simply ignored it. But this stranger, this customer she had just met, was putting himself on the line to stand up for her. Mrs. Henderson's friend, who had been silent up to this point, spoke up hesitantly. We didn't know she was a veteran. We just thought— You thought what? Colonel Morrison asked. That someone with tattoos must be a bad person? That the way someone looks tells you everything you need to know about their character? The third woman looked uncomfortable. Maybe we should go. We didn't mean any harm. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't ready to back down. Military service is admirable, but that doesn't mean workplace dress codes don't apply. There are ways to honor fallen soldiers that don't involve displaying tattoos at work. Colonel Morrison realized that words alone weren't going to be enough to make his point. Some people needed to see the truth with their own eyes before they would believe it. He had been planning to make a simple statement in Sarah's defense, but now he knew he needed to do something more dramatic. It was time to show these women exactly who they were dealing with. Colonel Morrison looked directly at Mrs. Henderson and her friends, his expression growing more serious. You know what? I think you ladies need to understand something about service and sacrifice. About what it really means to honor those who have given everything for our freedom. Without another word, he began unbuttoning his shirt. Sarah and the three women watched in confusion as he methodically worked his way down the front of the garment. Other customers in the pharmacy had started to notice the commotion, and a small crowd was beginning to gather. Sir, what are you doing? Mrs. Henderson asked, her voice rising with alarm. Colonel Morrison didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled off his shirt completely, revealing a torso covered in military tattoos that told the story of 3 decades of service to his country. The artwork was even more extensive than Sarah's, covering most of his chest, back, and both arms. The pharmacy fell completely silent. Every person in the building was staring at the distinguished-looking man who had just transformed before their eyes, from an ordinary customer into a walking testament to military service and sacrifice. On his chest, a large eagle globe, an anchor dominated the center, the iconic symbol of the United States Marine Corps rendered in incredible detail. Surrounding it were the names and dates of every unit he had served with, every deployment he had completed, every battle he had fought in during his long career. His left arm featured a memorial piece similar to Sarah's, but even larger and more complex. It honored the Marines under his command who had been killed in action over the years. Each name was carefully inscribed in elegant script, surrounded by symbols of their individual achievements and personalities. Purple hearts, bronze stars, and other medals were woven into the design, creating a tapestry of heroism and loss. On his right arm, a detailed rendering of the American flag flowed from his shoulder to his wrist, with the words "These colors don't run" scripted beneath it. His back featured an intricate scene depicting Marines raising the flag at Iwo Jima, one of the most iconic images in military history. But it was the tattoo on his lower chest that drew the most attention. In bold letters across his ribs were the words, "All my heroes wear dog tags." Mrs. Henderson and her friends stood frozen in shock. This was clearly not what they had expected when they decided to complain about Sarah's appearance. The man standing before them was obviously someone of importance, someone who commanded respect, and he was covered in far more tattoos than the young pharmacy technician they had been criticizing. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes as she studied Colonel Morrison's tattoos. She recognized many of the symbols and understood the stories they told. Here was someone who had given his entire adult life to serving others, and he wore his experiences proudly on his skin for the world to see. Other customers in the pharmacy were having similar reactions. Several elderly veterans in the crowd had come to attention, recognizing the rank and service record displayed on Colonel Morrison's body. A few were wiping away tears as they read the memorial pieces honoring fallen comrades. 30 years I served in the Marine Corps, Colonel Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent pharmacy. I've been shot at, bombed, and mortared. I've held dying Marines in my arms and written letters to their families. I've missed birthdays, anniversaries, and holidays to serve my country in some of the most dangerous places on earth. He gestured to his tattoos. Every single one of these tells a story of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood. They're not decorations or fashion statements. They're permanent reminders of the most important experiences of my life, and the people who didn't come home. Mrs. Henderson tried to speak, but Colonel Morrison held up his hand. This young woman, he continued, nodding toward Sarah, has tattoos that tell the same kind of stories. She risked her life repeatedly to save wounded soldiers under enemy fire. The artwork on her arm honors Marines and soldiers who died despite her best efforts to keep them alive. And you three want to have her fired because you don't like the way she looks? The crowd was growing larger as other customers and even some employees from other parts of the store came to see what was happening. Several people were taking pictures and videos with their phones, though Colonel Morrison seemed completely unbothered by the attention. An elderly man wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap pushed through the crowd and approached Colonel Morrison. "Colonel, thank you for your service, sir, and thank you for standing up for all of us who wear our service with pride." He turned to look at Mrs. Henderson and her friends. "You should be ashamed of yourselves. This young lady has done more for this country than you'll ever know." More veterans in the crowd began speaking up, sharing their own experiences with discrimination and prejudice based on their appearance. A younger man with Iraq War tattoos rolled up his sleeves to show artwork similar to Sarah's and Colonel Morrison's. An older woman revealed a small anchor tattoo on her wrist, explaining that she had served in the Navy during the Gulf War. The atmosphere in the pharmacy had completely changed. What had started as an attack on Sarah's character had transformed into an impromptu gathering of veterans supporting one another. People were sharing stories, comparing tattoos, and celebrating their shared experiences of service and sacrifice. Mrs. Henderson looked increasingly uncomfortable as she realized how badly she had misjudged the situation. Her friends were already backing away, clearly wanting to distance themselves from the confrontation. But Colonel Morrison wasn't done yet. "I want you to look around this room," he said to the three women. "Look at all these people who have served their country. Look at the respect they're showing for each other and for this young woman who has earned their admiration through her service and her sacrifice." He put his shirt back on, but kept it unbuttoned so his tattoos remained visible. "This is what real patriotism looks like. It's not about judging people based on their appearance or making assumptions about their character. It's about recognizing service when you see it and showing respect for those who have earned it." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the scene unfold around her. For the first time in 2 years, she felt truly supported and understood by the people in her community. But the most powerful moment was yet to come. The pharmacy manager, David Chen, had heard the commotion from his office and came rushing out to see what was happening. He expected to find some kind of customer complaint or medical emergency, but instead he walked into a scene unlike anything he had ever witnessed in his 20 years of pharmacy management. The store was packed with people, many of them clearly emotional, And in the center of it all stood a shirtless man covered in military tattoos talking to a group of increasingly uncomfortable-looking women. Behind the counter, Sarah was crying, though she seemed to be tears of gratitude rather than distress. "What's going on here?" David asked, approaching Colonel Morrison cautiously. Before anyone else could answer, Mrs. Henderson rushed toward the manager with obvious relief. "Thank goodness you're here. We came to complain about your employee's unprofessional appearance, and this man started making a scene. We just wanted someone who looked more appropriate working at the counter." David looked from Mrs. Henderson to Colonel Morrison to Sarah, trying to piece together what had happened. He had always been aware of the occasional complaints about Sarah's tattoo, but he had never taken them seriously. Sarah was one of his best employees, knowledgeable, reliable, and genuinely caring toward customers. Her appearance had never interfered with her ability to do her job excellently. Colonel Morrison stepped forward and extended his hand to David. "I apologize for the disruption, sir. I'm Colonel James Morrison, United States Marine Corps. I felt compelled to intervene when I witnessed these ladies harassing your employee about her military memorial tattoo." David shook the colonel's hand, immediately understanding the significance of the situation. "Military memorial tattoo?" "Yes, sir. Your pharmacy technician is a combat veteran who served 2 tours in Afghanistan as a medic. The tattoo these ladies are complaining about honors the fallen soldiers from her unit. I have similar tattoos myself, which is why I felt the need to speak up." David looked at Sarah with new understanding. He had always known she was special, but she had never mentioned her military service. Now her professionalism, her ability to handle medical emergencies, and her natural leadership qualities made perfect sense. "Sarah, is this true?" he asked gently. Sarah nodded, wiping away more tears. "Yes, sir. I served with the 82nd Airborne as a combat medic from 2018 to 2022. I should have mentioned it when you hired me, but I was worried it might affect my chances of getting the job." "Worried it might affect your chances?" David repeated in amazement. "Sarah, military medical training is one of the most valuable qualifications someone in your position could have. Why on earth would you hide that?" Sarah glanced at Mrs. Henderson and her friends, who were looking more embarrassed by the minute. "Because of reactions like this. People see the tattoos and make assumptions about who I am without knowing anything about my story." David felt a surge of anger at the injustice his employee had been facing. Sarah was one of the most professional, knowledgeable, and compassionate people he had ever worked with. The fact that she had been hiding her military service because she was afraid of discrimination made him furious. "Mrs. Henderson," he said, turning to face the woman who had started this whole confrontation. "Let me make something very clear. Sarah Martinez is not only one of the finest employees this pharmacy has ever had, but she's also a decorated combat veteran who served our country with distinction. The tattoo you're complaining about is a memorial to fallen soldiers, and I consider it an honor to have her display it in my pharmacy." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed red. "Well, I still think there should be standards." "There are standards," David interrupted firmly. "The standard is excellence in customer service, medical knowledge, and professional conduct. Sarah exceeds those standards every single day. Your complaint is not about her performance or her qualifications. It's about your personal prejudice, and that's not something I'm going to accommodate." The crowd of veterans and other customers began applauding David's response. Several people called out words of support for both Sarah and the manager's decision to back his employee. Colonel Morrison smiled approvingly. "You're a good man, sir. Sarah is lucky to work for someone who recognizes her value." "Actually, I'm the lucky one," David replied. "I just wish I had known about her service record sooner. Sarah, from now on, I want you to feel free to display your tattoos with pride. Anyone who has a problem with them can answer to me personally." Sarah broke down crying again, overwhelmed by the support she was receiving. For 2 years, she had hidden an important part of her identity because she was afraid of exactly the kind of confrontation that had just occurred. But instead of the humiliation and job loss she had feared, she had found understanding, respect, and protection. An elderly woman who had been watching the entire scene unfold approached the counter. She was clearly moved by what she had witnessed, and she wanted to add her voice to the chorus of support. "Young lady," she said to Sarah, "I want you to know that my husband served in Vietnam, and he came home with tattoos that told the story of his service too. People didn't understand them then either, but he wore them proudly because they meant something important to him. You should never have to hide who you are or what you've done for this country. More customers began sharing their own stories. A middle-aged man revealed that his son was currently deployed overseas and had gotten a tattoo similar to Sarah's after losing friends in combat. A woman talked about her brother who had served in Iraq and struggled with similar discrimination when he returned home. The pharmacy had become an impromptu support group, with veterans and their families, connecting over shared experiences and mutual understanding. Mrs. Henderson and her friends found themselves increasingly isolated as more and more people spoke up in Sarah's defense. Finally, one of Mrs. Henderson's companions tugged on her sleeve. "Come on, Helen, let's just go. We were wrong about this." Mrs. Henderson looked around at all the faces staring at her, finally beginning to understand the magnitude of her mistake. She had come into this pharmacy thinking she was standing up for community standards, but instead she had attacked a hero and found herself facing an entire community that disagreed with her actions. I didn't know," she said quietly. "I'm sorry. I should have asked before I assumed." Colonel Morrison nodded graciously. "That's all any of us can ask for, ma'am. Next time, maybe consider that there might be more to someone's story than what you see on the surface." As Mrs. Henderson and her friends finally left the pharmacy, the atmosphere remained charged with emotion. But something fundamental had changed in that building and in the life of Sarah Martinez. In the weeks that followed the confrontation at the pharmacy, word of what had happened spread throughout the community like wildfire. The story of the Marine colonel who had defended a veteran pharmacy technician touched hearts and changed minds across the small town. Local newspapers picked up the story, and soon it was being shared on social media platforms around the country. Sarah found herself at the center of a transformation that went far beyond her own personal experience. The pharmacy became a gathering place for veterans in the community, many of whom had never felt comfortable sharing their stories before. David Chen, recognizing the positive impact this was having, decided to formalize the support by creating a weekly Veterans Coffee Hour every Saturday morning. Colonel Morrison became a regular visitor to the pharmacy, not just as a customer but as a friend and mentor to Sarah. He had been impressed by her strength and professionalism during the confrontation, and he wanted to help her understand the full value of her service and experience. "You know," he told her during one of their conversations, "what happened that day wasn't really about tattoos. It was about respect and understanding and the courage to stand up for what's right. You showed incredible strength in the face of ignorance and prejudice." Sarah had been thinking about that day constantly since it happened. For the first time in years, she felt proud to be seen as a veteran, rather than ashamed of the judgments people made about her appearance. The memorial tattoo on her arm was no longer something she felt compelled to hide, but rather a badge of honor that connected her to a community she had been afraid to claim. "I never thought about it that way," she replied. "For so long, I felt like I had to choose between honoring my fallen friends and fitting into civilian society. I thought I could only be one or the other. That's the trap a lot of veterans fall into," Colonel Morrison explained. "We come home and try to become someone else, someone we think civilian society will accept. But the truth is, our service is part of who we are, and when we hide it, we're denying both ourselves and our communities the full benefit of our experience." The conversation sparked something in